Hello and welcome to our 2021 Education Law Symposium. The topic of this segment is entitled Catholic Schools in the United States, the Intersect of Canon Law and U.S. Civil Law. I'm Father Brian Pham, and I am a presenter or the presenter of this segment. I'm a Jesuit priest belonging to the USA West Province of the Society of Jesus. And I'm currently based in Spokane, Washington at Gonzaga University. Here at Gonzaga, I am an assistant professor of law, and I'm the supervising attorney for one of our law clinics, the General Public Practice and Indian Law Clinic. I'm also a judge and a defender of the bond in the Metropolitan Marriage Tribunal in the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. I've been practicing both civil law and canon law since 2011 and 2013, respectively. My areas of canon law tends to be obviously marriage, annulment, but also in the area of temporal goods and jurisdiction issues. And in my practice of civil law, I now do general public practice, poverty law basically, but I also do quite a bit of contract law as well as immigration and asylum law. It's always good to start with a disclaimer. Please understand the purpose of this presentation is to give you a general overview of canon law and how canon law intersects with civil law in the context of a Catholic school in the United States, right? The purpose here is not to be comprehensive, to tell you everything you need to know about all these legal issues. Hopefully the presentation will sort of help you gain an appreciation for the complexity and maybe even help you address some of the issues that may be going on currently at your school. If something emerges in your particular context, it's always good to consult a lawyer and a canon lawyer, right? And by a lawyer, I mean someone who is licensed and is in good standing with the Bar Association in your jurisdiction. And when I say canonist, I mean specifically someone with a degree in canon law, either a licentiate or a doctorate in canon law from a pontifical faculty. So always good to consult with them. I'm always available. At the end of this presentation, I will give you my contact information. You can always reach out to me and we can have a one-on-one consultation. And as always, there is an outline that accompanies this presentation. So please feel free to follow along with this presentation in order to help you understand the process a little more as we move forward. When we talk about laws and how laws impact Catholic schools, right? We talk about different categories of law that would impact Catholic schools, right? First, we're going to look at civil law. Under civil law, right, the various legal issues that a Catholic school may encounter: constitutional law issues, 3%, tort law or civil litigation, 2%, right? And when I say constitutional law, I mean things like freedom of religion, right? How does a school exercise its authority within the secular context, right? When we talk about tort law, we're referring here specifically to some kind of something that happens. Let's say, you know, a student walked down the hallway and the student slips and fall because of a wet pavement, you know, because of the wet floor, and the family ends up suing the school, right, or the parish that hosts the school. That would be tort law, right? But if you look towards the bottom, right, federal and state statutes and regulation, notice that it's 47%. So 47% of what a school deals with, right, has to do with whether or not they're following or they're complying with federal and state statutes. And the bigger portion here, we look here at contract law, 47.5%. So this is where I think if you have to focus your energy on in terms of, you know, how to run a school and how to sort of avoid the legal issues that may come up, contract is going to be key. And then you look at federal and state statutes, right? So again, 3% constitutional law, 2% torts or civil litigation, 0.5%, a very small amount, right, having to do with common law or case law, 47% federal and state statutes or regulations, and then the largest portion, which is 47.5%, would be dealing with contract law. That being said, when it comes to Catholic schools in the United States, 100% of what happens, right, in a Catholic school, right, has to do with canon or ecclesiastical law, right? So as you can see, right, everything you do on a Catholic school campus touches on canon law. Some of the things you do on your campus touch on one of the other civil law, right? But it's important though that sometimes these laws may come into conflict with each other. So for example, a contract law, right? There may be a contract between the school and the teacher. And under contract law, that may be very good and true and valid and enforceable. Those same contracts may not necessarily be enforceable under canon law. And then vice versa, there may be requirements under canon law that teachers or employees of a Catholic school may have to agree to. And those things that we ask teachers and faculty to agree to, right, may be contrary to federal or state statutes, or maybe not allowed under constitutional law, right? So these things you always have to make sure and navigate between these two bodies of law, and then to see how they work through this whole process require a lot of thinking and maybe consultation with both a civil lawyer as well as a canon lawyer. In the past century or so, right, there were major Supreme Court cases that really impact Catholic schools in the United States. Here are some of the important cases that I want to kind of highlight to you a little bit. It's important to look at. Again, this particular presentation, this particular slide, right, will be in your outline so you can review it a little better, right? But I think there are other presentations during this symposium where I think some of these cases may be addressed more specifically. But for the context, for the purpose of context, I want to present these cases out there just to let you to become aware of, okay? So these are US Supreme Court cases that impacts Catholic schools in the United States. When we talk about canon law, right, I think a lot of Catholics don't know what canon law is, or they know the word, but they don't actually know what it means or where it comes from. So when we talk about canon law, we're talking about a legal system that is one of the oldest legal system, oldest, most continuous legal systems, right, in the world, right? And for us, right, Vatican City State is both a country and a religion. Catholic is both a, Catholic is our religion, Vatican City State is a country, and countries have legal system, right? So canon law is that legal system that governs Vatican City State. But unlike a lot of legal systems of countries, right, when, let's say, for example, we are Americans, but when we leave the US law doesn't apply to us. Canon law, when you are in Vatican City State, applies to you, but when you leave Vatican City State, canon law follows you also. So for anyone who works in a Catholic school, canon law applies to them. For every Catholic who's been baptized in the church, canon law applies to them, right? So you don't have to just be in Vatican City State for canon law to apply. If you are Catholic or you have any interaction with the Catholic Church or Catholic institutions, canon law applies to you. Now, it goes back a long way. The first codification of canon law was in 1140 by Gratian. For the purpose of our conversation, right, the most recent codification of canon law was in 1983. So from here on in, when we talk about canon law, we are referring to the 1983 Code of Canon Law. So keep that in mind. One of the most important things that I think is relevant to our conversation when it comes to Catholic schools and canon law and civil law is this notion of persons, right? Persons help us understand and contextualize what we're talking about. What do we mean when we talk about the rights of Catholics and Catholic institutions in the United States? And also, it also highlights the conflict that we may have with civil law, right? So I want to focus our attention on, at this moment, on this notion of persons. In canon law, right, there are three understandings of persons, right? The first set of persons, there are two of them, we call them moral persons. This includes the Catholic Church and the Holy See, right? Moral persons were created by God, right? God created them. They have no ownership of anything. They don't have any particular rights, but the fact that they exist because God willed that they exist. So that would be the moral persons, right? And then there's the so-called physical person, the natural person, persons like you and me who were born by birth, right? And as physical person, we obtain rights under canon law through our baptism, right? So once you've been baptized, the 1983 Code of Canon Law applies to you. And then the third kinds of person, the so-called juridic person. And this is where we're going to focus the bulk of our conversation on for the remainder of this presentation. Juridic persons are institutions. They would be very similar to secular law's notion of corporations. Okay, corporation, juridic person. So under juridic persons, there are two categories, right? You have the public juridic person and the private juridic persons. Now, we will focus mainly on the public juridic persons rather than private juridic persons, but just understand and appreciate that they're both within canon law. Private juridic persons are created when a competent ecclesiastical authority approves their statutes. Here we refer to the rules, the bylaws, the constitution, etc. They're governed by their own statutes. Now, again, these same statutes that have been approved by the church. They may only use the title Catholic with explicit permission from the competent ecclesiastical authority. Private juridic persons act in their own names, right? So they do not speak on behalf of the church. Private juridic person may own properties, but those properties are considered temporal good and they're not considered ecclesiastical property. That's an important term, right? Because when something becomes ecclesiastical property, right, that means they're governed by canon law. But for private juridic person, their properties are simply referred to as temporal goods, and they may not necessarily be governed by canon law. Instead, properties of private juridic persons are governed by their own statutes, which have been approved by the competent ecclesiastical authority. Private juridic person ceases to exist, right, when it's approved according to its approved rules and laws, right? So in the constitutions or in the rules, the bylaws of private juridic person, there would be something that would stipulate when a private juridic person's, when its life comes to an end, right? So they do not exist in perpetuity. Here's some examples of private juridic persons, right? Some of these private juridic person may already or may someday seek to become public juridic person, but for the most part, they are private juridic persons. And then there's the so-called public juridic person. And again, this is where we're going to focus our attention on for the remainder of this presentation. Public juridic persons are created by a competent ecclesiastical authority by a formal decree, right? They're governed by approved decrees and rules, right? Bylaws and statutes and constitutions. The properties of public juridic persons are considered ecclesiastical goods, right? And because these properties are not just temporal goods, but they're ecclesiastical goods, right? They're governed by Book 5 of the 1983 Code of Canon Law. The mission of a public juridic person, right, comes from the church itself, right? So all missions of public juridic persons come from the church. Public juridic person acts on behalf of the church. So they do act in the name of the church. They do not need to use, or they do not need the permission of the local ordinary to be called Catholic, because they are, in fact, an extension of the church, right? And then they have the right to exist in perpetuity, meaning there's no expiration date, right, for public juridic persons, right? What are some example of public juridic person, right? Are individual Catholic dioceses, individual Catholic parishes, a province of a religious institute, right? Or the entire religious institute can also be a public juridic person, right? All Catholic seminaries, right? Conference of Major Superiors, Leadership Conference of Women Religious, right? These are example of public juridic persons. Now, where do schools fit in all of this, right? We're gonna get to that, because for the most part, most Catholic schools in the United States are not public juridic persons. They fall under a different category, right? So, again, understand, each public juridic person is distinct, right? They are their own entity, and we're going to talk more about what that means in a minute, okay? So each public juridic person are distinct, they're not together. So back to the example, right? A diocese is a public juridic person, a Catholic parish is a public juridic person. Now, we all know that in every diocese, there are parishes, right? And the bishop is the local ordinary of all the priests of all of the parishes. But under canon law, right? Under canon law, the parish as a public juridic person is independent from the diocese that is also a separate public juridic person. Now there's relationship, there's connections, right, between the bishops and the pastor, and there's a connection between the diocese and the parish itself. But for the most part, under this notion of juridic person, they are separate entities. Keep that in mind, okay? What is an example of a public juridic person when it comes to, let's say, the diocese, okay? So if you look at the larger circle, right, that's the public juridic person, so the diocese as a public juridic person. Within the diocese, there are certain ministries of pious work or certain properties that belong to the diocese, right? So here we're talking about, let's say, the Dawson Pastor Center, for example. If there is a Dawson High School, right, that is attached to the diocese and not to a particular parish, that high school is considered a pious work, right, of the public juridic person that is the diocese, right? The cathedral, right? Again, the cathedral here may be a parish, which would be a separate entity, but let's say for the purpose of this conversation, the cathedral is part of the diocese, okay? So these are all examples of ministries and pious work, right, or properties that belong to the diocese. What does this mean? This means the diocese is a public juridic person, right? The Catholic high school, for example, right, is Catholic because it is an attached entity to the public juridic person that is the diocese. So the Cathedral High School here as the example, right, is not a public juridic person, but rather it is a ministry of the pious work, right? So if this high school stands apart, right, under canon law from the diocese, it is no longer a work of the diocese. It is no longer Catholic. So as long as the bishop or the diocese has control of that high school, it is now an extension of the diocese, right? But understand, the public juridic person is the diocese, not the high school, right? The public juridic person is the diocese, not the bishop. And we're going to talk more about the role of the bishop in a minute. Looking at a parish, right? In a similar way, looking at the parish as a public juridic person, right? The parish is the public juridic person, right? The rectory, the parish school, the church building, right? Those are ministries, pious work, or properties that belong to the parish. So the parish school that is apart from the parish itself, right, has no standing, right? That parish school only has canonical standing when it is attached to the parish itself. Notice though here, though, right, that the parish school is a pious work of the parish, not the diocese. Now, remember, the diocese is its own public juridic entity that has its own work and property and pious engagement, right? Here, the parish as a separate entity, right, has also property, right? The church building, the rectory, for example, right? And it also has ministry, which is the parish school, which means it's the pastor of the parish that has immediate control over the parish school, not the bishop, okay? Does that make sense? I hope that's clear a little bit, and we'll give you a few more examples down in a minute. If you are a religious community and you run a school, right? Very similar way. Here, I'll give you the example of the Jesuit community, right? The Jesuit community, here you see the blue presentation, that's the public juridic person. The high school attached to the community are the ministries that the Jesuits may be involved in, and the house itself, the physical building of the house itself, right? That would be considered ministries, pious work, or property of the religious community. So the high school, right, here, right, gets its Catholic identity, right, from the Jesuit community, which is the public juridic person. And later on, I will refer you to the various canons that talks about this, right? But for the time being, understand though that these are distinct, right? So the religious community as a house, right, is a public juridic person, and any ministries or property attached to that community, right, would be an extension. We call those ministries of pious work or property of the religious community. Okay, so back here again, right? The Catholic identity of the high school belonging to the diocese, right? It comes from the diocese itself because the diocese is a public juridic person. The Catholic identity of the parish school comes from the parish because the parish is the public juridic person and the parish school is a pious work of the parish. The Catholic identity of a high school or any school attached to a religious community, right? That religious community is the public juridic person and the school is an extension of the work or the ministry of that community. Now, what are some elements, right, of a public juridic person? So this is what public juridic person are required by Canon law to have, right? Public juridic person need to have an administrator. There must be some ecclesiastical good. Now remember, public juridic person's properties are called ecclesiastical good, not temporal goods, right? And then public juridic person can call itself Catholic. It receives its mission from the church, right? And it speaks on behalf of the church, right? But the two primary things, administrator, ecclesiastical goods. Notice though here that the property belongs to the juridic entity, not a person. The administrator has to be a physical person who is baptized, right? So I'll give you some example. Think of a diocese, right? A diocese, the bishop, the diocesan bishop is the administrator. The ecclesiastical goods, right, may include the diocesan office or the diocesan school itself, right? In the context of a parish, the pastor is the administrator, right? And the ecclesiastical goods of the parish may be the parish building itself, the school, and other ministries that may be associated, right, with the parish itself. So here, right, these are separate entities. The bishop is the administrator of the diocese. He does not own the property. The property rather belongs to the juridic person. The pastor is the administrator of a parish. He does not own the properties attached to the parish, which may also include the school, right? The schools, the parish, the various ministries are extension of the parish itself. Okay, and again, you can look at the same way with religious, with a religious institute, right? A religious institute, the house is the juridic person, the superior of the house is the administrator, and the physical building of the community or the school attached to the community are properties and ministries of the juridic person, that is the community, okay? So it's important to look at some different categories, right? After going through that example, hopefully this will be a little clearer, right? Catholic example of Catholic school. A diocesan school are institutions that are attached to the diocese. Parish or parochial schools are institutions that are attached to parishes. Schools operated or owned by religious institutes, right? Those are separate from parish school or diocesan schools, right? And then there's the so-called independent Catholic schools, right? And we've seen a growth of these schools in the past probably 20 years. Sometimes the juridical status is not always clear. Understand that terms such as affiliate, sponsor, partnership, associate, right? Those terms do not have any meaning or do not have any canonical meaning or status under canon law. I know that this happens quite a bit with schools that are hosted or sponsored by religious organization, religious institute, right? Understand that canon law does not recognize terms such as affiliate, sponsor, partnership, association, associate, right? These don't have any meaning, right? So understand though that each of your school has some connection to the religious body that sponsors it. If you are a diocesan institute, right? If you're a school that is run by the diocese, you're attached to the entire diocese itself, right? That is a public juridic person. If you are a parochial school or a school attached to a parish, your pastor is your administrator. If you're a school run and owned by a religious institute, the superior of the religious community, right, is the administrator of that entity. So what does this look like in civil law? Diocesan school, for example, right? You have the diocese, which is the public juridic person, right? There may be a school attached to it, and it would be considered the pious work of the diocese, right? And the bishop is the administrator of that. But oftentimes we see the diocese incorporated as an entity under state law, and then you have the school incorporated separately under state law, right? So in that particular case, you may have a diocesan board, right, that runs the school. And that board may include the bishop, the vicar for education, maybe the CEO, the president of the school, for example, right? And then you have the diocesan school itself, which is, has a principal, president, dean, faculty, for example, right? So under canon law only recognizes that first level, the diocese, which is the public juridic person, Everything that comes later are considered extension of that, right? Under civil law, however, right, they may see a distinction between the diocese and the diocesan school or the diocesan board, right? Understand how that works in your context. Under civil law, the diocesan board or the diocesan school may be independent from the diocese. Under canon law, however, right, canon law does not recognize the diocesan board that is civilly incorporated or the school that is separate from the diocese, right? How do these things maintain some kind of connection under canon law? It's going to be through their bylaws, right? It's going to be through who sits on which board, who has control, who has reserved power, okay? Under canon law, only the diocese is recognized as a juridic person. Everything else would be an extension of it. Under state secular law, right, they may see these as 2 or 3 separate corporations, right? So you need to make sure you look at your articles of incorporation. You need to look at your bylaws in order to maintain some kind of relationships, right? Oftentimes, bishop would have to approve before a school is split away or at least separately incorporated. The same thing with a parish, right? Parish as a juridic person, that's what canon law recognizes. The parish may have a school attached to it. And because of civil litigations and legal protection, right, the grade school attached to the parish may be separately incorporated as a separate entity from the parish. Sure, so there may be a civil board. Members of that civil board at the parish level, right, maybe the pastor, the principal, so on and so forth, right? There may be even a diocesan representative, right, on that board, right? And then the school is operated by the principal, assisted by the dean, the chairs, faculty, so on and so forth. But similar to the previous slide, right? Canon law only recognized the parish as the juridic person. Everything else, right? The board, the school, those are extensions of the public juridic person. So here again, under canon law, only one entity exists. Under civil law, they may be 2 or 3 entities that are separate. And how do these entities maintain a relationship together in order to be legal under canon law? You're going to look at the bylaw. You're going to look at reserved power, right? You're going to look at the membership of the board, right? Who is on the board, who has controlling authority. Canon law does not recognize civil incorporation of entities. It only recognizes the public juridic person. A very similar example, right? School owned and operated by a religious institute. Again, canon law recognizes the religious community as the public juridic person, right? It is the religious community that is the owner of the school. The school is the pious work of the religious community. The administrator would be the superior of the house, right? Now, the school may be separately incorporated from the religious community. If that's the case, right, then the school under civil law is seen as a separate entity from the community. Canon law, however, again, does not recognize civil incorporation, right? So therefore, it only sees it as one entity. In order to maintain a relationship between the school board, and the religious community, you look at bylaws, you look at who's in charge, you look at ownership, you look at articles of incorporation. So you got to make sure that even though you are separately incorporating under civil law, right, you need to develop mechanism or put in the bylaws different things in order to make sure that the community is somehow still maintain a strong control or strong connection to the school itself. Because again, canon law does not recognize civil incorporation of entities, right? It only recognizes the public juridic person, which is the religious community. So it brings an interesting conversation here, right? The school is Catholic, but that Catholicism or that idea of that identity of being Catholic, right, comes from the fact that it is attached to the religious community, not independent of. So again, remember we talk about Canada does not recognize the notion of sponsorship or partnership or affiliate, right? A school may have an affiliate with the religious community under secular tradition or culture, right? Canon law does not recognize that. Canon law will see the school or the school board as an extension of the religious community. The school maintains its Catholic identity so long as it is considered a pious work of the religious community, which means the superior of the religious community has authority over the school, right? How does that work? Again, you look at your bylaws and you need to make sure that language in the bylaws and articles of incorporation, right, reflect the reality under canon law. So this doesn't mean these schools or these things cannot happen. It just means that you need to make sure that the legal mechanism that you use to do separate incorporation reflect the values and what canon law allow. So Catholic institutions and civil incorporation, right, option to consider where available. You have to look at your states, right, at your jurisdiction. There's a corporation sole model, right? This means the person owns everything. This is the model that really they do not like. Canon law does not like sole corporation model because don't forget, under canon law, it's the public juridic person that owns the property, not an individual person, right? So we know in the past, I would say the past 20, 25 years with the abuse and with the abuse of minor, and various dioceses have to declare bankruptcy. And this raised a lot of concern because many of the dioceses that have been in the news in the recent past, right, were incorporated as a corporation sole, where the bishop owns the property, right? That is really in violation of canon law, right? The administrator is not the owner of the property, right? The property belongs to the public juridic person. But again, depending on your jurisdiction, corporation sole may be the only option you have. You work with that, right? Separate incorporation, right? Separate incorporation can be the diocesan corporation sole that does not include the property of the parishes. Parish corporation may or may not include the parochial school, right? School educational corporation, right? These are different models that you have, right? Again, when a public juridic person is civilly incorporated, the canonical status of the juridic person does not change, right? And this conversation has been debated in the McGraw and Maida debate going back to the late 1960s, right? You always want to make sure you understand and clarify, right, the relationship between the institution and the school and the sponsoring institution through the articles of incorporation. You look at the bylaw, right? These things should articulate the canonical juridical relationship, right, between the juridic person and the pious work of the school, right? And again, terms such as affiliate, sponsor, partnership, associate, right, have no canonical status, have no canonical meaning in canon law, right? So what does it look like, right? So I'll give you a more clear example, right? Consider a makeup story, right? A makeup example, St. Mary Catholic Parish, right? With a school attached to it. So this is your typical parish with a school attached to it, okay? Under canon law, that's what they see, right? St. Mary Catholic Parish is a public juridic person, right? And St. Mary School is a pious work of it. So you can separately incorporate St. Mary's Parish Corporation and St. Mary School Corporation, right? So the green, right, light green or dark green, that's under civil law, right? But under canon law, only the red part is recognized, okay? Only the red part is recognized, right? How does that work? Well, state law allows entity to be incorporated, but it's gonna, again, the bylaw and the articles of incorporation will show the relationship, right? So it's perhaps one of the things you can do here is, under St. Mary Parish Corporation, the pastor is the administrator. There may be a board, right? The same board could be the same board for St. Mary Grade School, right? So you're going to look at the board structure in your own state and see what is permitted. But whatever it is that you do, you want to make sure to maintain a constant relationship between the juridic entity and its work. Okay, so again, public juridic person, the parish, with the school attached. Where possible, right, the two separates under civil law, the parish corporation and the school corporation. Both of these things are separate under state law, right, under corporation law, but under canon law, they retain the same identity. So what does this look like really, right? Here, right? So look at we're gonna look at the blue part first and then the green part, right? So look at the blue part, right? The pastor, right? He's a CEO, right, of the parish, right? There may be a governing board, right? That may include consultants, parish consultants, finance council, so on and so forth, right? And then you have the school, right? And then the other side, my mistake, I'm sorry. The blue is the parish, and the blue is the school, and the green is the parish, right? You can set up the body that looks that way, that allows you to have both sides to be lawful, both under canon law and civil law, okay? Similar way, okay? Separate boards, separate entity, but you can have the same people on both boards, right? In order to maintain some kind of connection or control by the religious entity over the school. Things to look for, however, right? Even though you have a parish and a school that are separate, right? There's a thing called the corporate veil. So the corporate veil is that corporations need to behave like corporations, right? When one corporation intervene or interfere in another in the working of another corporation, that's going to cause some problems, right? So what it is that you need to do, right? You have to be careful. Sometimes because the school is small and the parish is small, they share resources. That's good on one level, but it may not be good under corporate law. Okay, so for example, if you're sharing a bookkeeper between the parish and the religious community or the parish, right, that's going to be a problem. So make sure that the bookkeeper is paid separately, right? Maybe a stipend for each whenever he or she engages in work for each institution separately, right? Sometimes it's easier, let's say you share a maintenance staff, right? If they're two separate corporations, they should engage in activities separately, not together, right? When it comes to funds and comminglings of funds, you have to be careful not to do that, right? So the school should have its own bank account, the religious community should have its own bank account, the parish should have its own bank account, right? Not having separate meetings or not keeping separate minutes for minutes of different meetings is also a problem. So make sure though that each corporation engage in activities that is independent from the other corporation, right? So if you're a school and your parish and you're two separate corporations, have two sets of meetings, right? Have very clear understanding when the maintenance staff, when they're cleaning the school or when they're cleaning the parish, make sure that they're paid separately, right? The same thing with bookkeeping, right? Some things to consider, again, you may have discussed this in some of your other presentation when it comes to the law, right? Teachers at Catholic schools do not have the same constitutional rights as teachers of public schools. Keep that in mind, right? The main defense, the main thing that you want to look at, again, 47.5% of Catholic schools deal with contract laws in some manner, right? Contract law was something that will protect both teachers and schools, right? Administrators, including pastors and bishops, right, must honor the terms of the contract, right, that made with teachers and staff, right? There need to be a legitimate reason for breaching a contract. So just because there's a contract doesn't mean you cannot breach it, right? But if you do breach a contract, you need to make sure you have legitimate reasons why you need to do that, right? Court have considered, faculty and staff handbook, manuals, and policy statement as part of the employment contract, right? So if you have not updated your handbook or your manual or policy statement in a while, please do that. I would recommend you do this on an annual basis. Maybe have a committee, right? Every year that would go through sections or parts or all of the faculty and staff handbook to update things. There are always new law, there are always new activities that's happening that you need to make sure that these things are updated, right? So again, because contract law plays such a key role, right, in Catholic schools in the United States, and it's through contract law where both the institutions and the people working in the institutions have protections. Make sure that the contracts are always updated. And that means handbooks, manuals, and policy statements, right? Canon law specifically, right? In the Code of Canon Law, right? What are some of the relevant canons you want to look to, right? So it's going to be canon, I'm going a little backward here, right? But the Catholic schools, you're going to deal with mainly canons from canon 793 to canon 806, right? Religious institutes, right? When you engage in ministry in a diocese, canon 611 to canon 613 are going to be your key canons, right? And when it comes to juridic entity, juridic persons, it's going to be canons 113 and 123, right? Also, make sure you pay attention to guidelines, right, produced by the Bishops' Conference, okay? And then there are two categories I want you to pay attention to, right? Particular law and proper law, right? Every diocese creates its own law potentially. Laws that comes out of diocese, those are called particular law, right? Laws that comes out of religious institutes, those are called proper law, right? Now, depending on what you do, depending on the relationship you have with the diocese, right? These two laws are important. So again, not just the universal Code of Canon Law, right? The 1983 Code of Canon Law. Pay attention to guidelines, right? Produced by the Bishops' Conference. If you are working in a religious, if you're working with religious institute, right, you need to pay attention to that proper law. So let's say you are a principal of a Catholic school run by the Dominican sisters. Okay, you are the principal of the school. You have to pay attention to the particular law of the diocese because you're running a Catholic school in the diocese. But because you're working with women religious, and here in this case is the Dominican sisters, right? You got to pay attention to what their law says. So if you want to renew a contract with a teacher who's a religious sister, right? You have to pay attention to what does that religious sisters community, right? What do their laws say about renewal a contract? Can you go to her directly, or do you need to go to her superior, for example, right? In particular law, right? If you were to teach a religion in class and the diocese have a policy about religious texts or what kind of text you can use, right? If there's a particular law about that, you need to follow that, okay? The last thing that I want to say really is this notion of who's the boss, right? In canon law, it's so important to remember, right? Who can do what to whom, when, and how, right? And again, this is where I think oftentimes, even canonists get this confused sometimes, right? So I just want to highlight this a little bit. The term local ordinary competent ecclesiastical authorities, right? Those are not synonymous terms, okay? Local ordinaries, it's used 112 times. And it usually refers to, it always refers to the diocesan bishop. No ambiguity there, okay? The term ordinary is used 95 times, right? It does not always refer to the diocesan priest, the diocesan bishop. It may refer to religious superiors, right? And then the notion of competent ecclesiastical authority, right, also does not necessarily mean the local ordinary, the diocesan bishop, right? And that's used 26 times, right? So depending on the canons and what you see in the canon and the terms that the canon use, if the canon says you need permission from the local ordinary, yes, that means the diocesan bishop. If the canon says you need permission, or only the person with the authority who is an ordinary can give permission, right? Then you need to make sure the context, right, and the custom and how that notion ordinary is understood. It may mean the provincial superior. It may mean your pastor. It may mean the diocesan bishop, okay? Competent ecclesiastical authority, right? Again, think of it in the same way as ordinary. Who is competent to give the permission, right? So the code is very intentional in terms of how it uses the term local ordinary, competent ecclesiastical authority. The only clear thing here is when they say local ordinary, they're talking about the diocesan bishop. The other two terms, ordinary, competent ecclesiastical authority, right? They're a little bit more ambiguous, right? So read the canon, understand the context of the canon, right? And then lastly, here are some suggested reading, right, that I would highly recommend that you have in your library, in your office, as reference. And again, this will be available, right? This will be available in the handout for you, right? And here's my contact information should you have any questions or concern, right? I'm at Gonzaga University. My mailing address is 502 E Boone Avenue, Spokane, Washington. My phone number, that's my direct phone number to my office. Email is always the best way to get a hold of me, right? Should you want or should you require some one-on-one conversation, feel free, I'm always available. So you can set up a time and then we can do this on Zoom and we can have a conversation and talk in greater details about some concerns you may have. As always, it's always a pleasure to give this presentation. My preference has always been doing this in person because I think the one-on-one conversation in between sessions and the question and answer portion is always much more enriching than doing this pre-recorded. But again, I hope the presentation has been helpful to you. And should we cross paths in the future, feel free to introduce yourself in person and ask any question you may have. Have a great rest of the presentation.